Martin, bienvenue à Toronto. C'est un plaisir de vous rejoindre aujourd'hui. Yes, our two cities do get along. We were just talking before the break how former Mayor Cordaire and our current Mayor John Tory hosted an event here in Toronto a couple of years ago, to which Mayor Cordaire remarked how exciting the nighttime scene was in Toronto because 800 people from Montreal had moved into the city. So we've got a lot of cooperation happening. Now, let me allow to set the stage for our discussion today. Yesterday, I moderated a panel on the economic impact of city airports. And without a doubt, our city airports are critical point-to-point, people-to-people connectors for trade, for investment, and for major events. On the other hand, cargo, movement of goods, our supply chains, the critical ingredient there is our ports. And now I was saying to Martin earlier, I don't know if he knew, but in 1845, our organization was formed because the business community of the day were really focused on how to get a port in Toronto and then a rail network. They thought economic success and competitiveness meant controlling imports and exports out of this new world that was our part of the world. And I pulled out some of our original history books on the board. In fact, they were talking at great lengths with admiration about the Port of Montreal, even as far back as 1835. So lots of lessons that we can learn from you. Just quickly on our ports network, pre-pandemic, Canada's national port system generated more than 17 billion in economic output and 8 billion in GDP. That's simply the port. If you layer on indirect impact from businesses that supply services and employment, those numbers leap to 53 billion in economic output and 25 billion in the annual GDP. So last week, when the National Supply Chain Task Force released a report stating that our transportation supply chain is approaching its breaking point, the business community took notice. Urgent action is required to keep goods flowing because these are the very goods that keep our economy flowing. And among their key recommendations are easing port congestion, addressing labor shortages, and protecting our gateways, our important gateway like the Port of Montreal, from disruptions. An efficient and resilient supply chain is enabled by our ports. They remain a priority focus for us to advance our economic capacity and long-term growth. Now, in the context of Canada, we've got 17 port authorities. The Port of Montreal is second largest, but I would argue fastest growing, behind only Vancouver, who's also a city we're quite close to. Now, Martin, your port connects Canada to more than 140 countries. You moved more than 34 million metric tons of cargo from over 2,000 vessels last year. His port is one of the few to allow ships to bring cargo deep in the Canadian interior in a way that's far more environmentally friendly than any other mode of transportation. We also have really strong integration with our rail networks in the port, which is another critical enabler of that movement. The benefit of our port, the Port of Montreal, and our rail network is it helps Toronto and Montreal keep containers off our 400 series. It's faster inputs to manufacturing, lower costs for our consumers, and helps our downtown workers get home at the end of a long day. They're not stuck in traffic as much. Looking forward, the Port of Montreal is expanding. Opening in 2026, the new Contrecoeur terminal will move more than 1 million containers per year. And that's not all. That's just phase one. This is going to help business in Toronto and across the country improve our access to global markets and improve the manufacturing heft in this country. So Martin, this is a massive enterprise. You've been in your role as president and CEO for coming up to 2 years. Good timing with the timing of your start, heading right into a pandemic. But what surprised you the most about the industry?
Well, I've spent 25 years in the energy business, and it's a common theme today. The energy is linked to everything. And the energy business is well known to everyone, but the logistic industry is simply just not known. It's tolerated, but it's not known. And that took me by surprise. It's a very discreet, probably too discreet business sector. And it's something that fascinates me, how silent that industry was, because between production and ultimate consumption, we do represent the missing link, and we need to be better known. Otherwise, it's a business that is similar because to my previous life, because it's service, public service. It's essential. It's the infrastructure. It's the long-term aspect, and we're there for the success of our constituents, not our own success. So it's similar, but definitely it's a business that needs to be better known throughout the food chain.
Well, let's continue on that. We were talking before we joined the audience today. You know, you look at ports. I lived a long time in Asia, Hong Kong and Singapore. Those are critical parts of their economy. Huge investments, huge transformation happening with that. State of Texas, we've spent a lot of time looking at them because they've got multiple border crossings and rail that they need to connect to their port network. They spend a lot of time thinking about how do they improve the efficiency of goods movement throughout that state. But when I sit on advisory groups for various transportation and infrastructure ministries, it's all about transit, moving people. There's very little understanding or discussion about goods movement. So what do you see as the big trends coming up? You know, with the turbulence we've been through the past couple of years, what are the changes needed in the marketplace to really, as you said, get this on the radar, but more importantly, ensure our competitiveness going forward?
Well, I believe that the silver lining is present because we had so many crises that now we are top of the agenda. You've mentioned the report that was published by the federal government 2 weeks ago that says we absolutely need to tackle those issues because everyone is suffering economically, but is also suffering environmentally. So we do have the attention now. And we believe at the port and the industry in general that the 3D should be the focus of tomorrow. We need to digitize the business. We need to decongestion, and we need to decarbonize the business. And if we do the first 2D, we'll automatically meet the third one. We've heard a lot about digitization today. That industry needs the support. And there was also a very interesting announcement by the Minister of Transport last Friday in Vancouver, announcing that the port will have a role to play and to federate and put people around the industry together and be basically the middle person to help digitize the supply chain. So that's positive. But those three are the three angles to help the decongestion, the supply chain.
And decarbonization, you say, will be a net benefit of those first two Ds. Let's talk about that, climate change. We know that transportation, I believe it's mostly road transportation, generates about 40% of greenhouse gases. How do you see the decarbonization of our transportation sector?
Well, the most frustrating aspect of my life has been the transportation sector. When politicians and electors think about the ecosystem, they think about the production. And politicians will focus a lot about the production side because it's obvious. We need to decarbonize, let's say, the electricity sector and the production sector. But also, we need to decarbonize what everyone sees on every day, the purolator, the electric car. But you've mentioned it, 40% of the greenhouse gases comes from the transportation sector. And 40% of that 40 comes from the heavy transportation. And talking about Quebec only, every year for the last 10 years, we are making not 1% of progress in GHG reduction. Because what? We're good on the production side, we're doing great on the consumption, we're doing horribly on the transportation side. So we're going backward because of heavy truck, not having alternative for train, and our ships need to be decarbonized. If we don't tackle that middle point, there is no mathematical way we can meet Canada and Quebec goal. So that's a frustrating aspect, and we need to be top of mind for any politic initiatives in the coming months and years.
And what do you think it's going to take action?
I think we have a role to play. We need to be out there and promoting technical solution. One of the things that we want to do at the Port of Montreal is use hydrogen locally for our own locomotives. Second thing, we want to offer electric and hydrogen solution to the trucking industry. Every day, 2,500 trucks come to the Port of Montreal to go where? To go to Toronto, to Hamilton, to Abitibi region. those trucks basically do that type of buckle. They always come back to the same supply point. That is the most efficient and easy way to either put electric charges or green liquids like hydrogen. We're not talking about exporting those energies, but to use them locally because they all have a return to base concept. So we need to do that ASAP, and we need to break what I call the infrastructure dilemma. We as a public service could play a greater role in putting together and putting those infrastructure, so if we build it, they will come and break the infrastructure dilemma.
Well, it's interesting because the board has done a lot of work looking at movement of goods. We've got almost 40% of the country's manufacturing takes place in Southern Ontario. We've focused more on the trucks cross-border for automotive. And what our research has found is that staggering numbers, folks, of the trucks that originate in Ontario to go into the US, 75% return empty. And similarly, the ones originating in the US coming into Ontario, I think is about 65% return empty. So as you're talking about this point-to-point, which lends itself very well to electrification, let me put you on the spot and say, is there a solution you could help with the trucking industry to help them understand if they're picking up from the port on their way back rather than being empty, is there something they could pick up to bring to you? Is there a solution you think that could be brought
there? There are solutions. It comes with digitizing the business. They don't want to come back empty either.
Yeah.
So instead of thinking about the Port of Montreal, and by the way, the Port of Toronto, the Port of Ontario is the Port of Quebec. All the goods, or most of the goods that comes through Ontario comes from Vancouver and the Port of Montreal. Of course, some go through the Great Lakes and come directly to the Port of Hamilton and Toronto, but we are the Port of Ontario. And one of the things that we should start thinking is having an holistic approach of corridor. Instead of having just regional thinking of Montreal talking about its community, and then Hamilton, its community, and Quebec, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Great Lakes, Quebec, Toronto, this is one big corridor. So if we think not in a competition mood, but we think holistically about that corridor, we will put environmentally sound solution all along that corridor. So it's with infrastructure, but also with data sharing. If we do share the data in that corridor, and if the Port of Toronto wins more because they have the information that that truck comes back with a full container, it's all good. Port authorities are not there for their own good, they're there for your good. So I really think reaching out and building a significantly or a seamless corridor around the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence will be one way to optimize the supply chain.
Well, the piece, just quickly, how many folks from the US in the room? Show of hands. Okay, no hands, so let's have this conversation. The conversation I wanted to have is there's the marine movement of cargo is happening by American companies, American ports, and Canadian companies, Canadian ports. How do we create competitive advantage, this corridor concept? How do we create competitive advantage for our ports and our side of the Great Lakes?
Competitive advantage comes with foreseeability. We need to have the port and logistic infrastructure that allows foreseeable and seamless service. That's one of the reasons you've mentioned that in your opening remarks. Today, Montreal port is basically at capacity. We handle close to 2 million containers. By the way, it's 100 billions of dollars of goods that comes through the Port of Montreal. So we're at capacity. If you're a shipping line today and you see, am I going to go to the Port of Montreal in the next 25 years? They need to know that we will have excess capacity in the future. A public service can be in advance of its time and lose money, or a public service can be late of its time and looks dummy. We will be the one leading the show. That's why we're expanding so significantly the port. You've mentioned it. We intend to start construction next year and had 60% of additional capacity year one of that new terminal on the South Shore to provide foreseeability in the supply chain. So the shipping line and the cargo beneficial, the companies in Ontario and the Midwest and Quebec can think about the best way is going through the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes and avoid New York. So it's more competitive, it's faster, and emits less GHG.
And it's not just the ports, it's how do you connect the other modes of transit?
Absolutely. We need to think about intermodal. There's no one solution. Of course, Montreal is very well served by the two main railways, CP and CN. CN is very close to our expansion on the South Shore. They already have facilities. In my mind, when I close my eyes and I see the new terminal on the South Shore, it's 1 million containers using a new bullet line from Quebec to Toronto to the Midwest. That's how I see. Not only it's seamless, but it's really competitive. And again, we think that it would be the corridor that emits the less GHG because our port will be carbon neutral at its opening, and we want to electrify everything that is around the port. So.
Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about the geopolitical implications to supply chains. Tough topic. How are you tackling that? How are you preparing our economy to be able to respond to the challenges that are existing now, many of which are outside our control?
They are outside of our control, but one thing I think Canada has realized is that port facility is also a tool that could be served from a diplomacy standpoint. People or countries that went through we had 3 different crises. We had the COVID, and then we had Chinese shutdown while we were consuming, and then we were still consuming and everyone was back at it and everything was jammed everywhere. Countries that went through those 3 crises and suffered the less are the ones who had sufficient fluid infrastructure. So today, Canadian government realizes that a port, which is basically a boundary, is also a frontier, are part of the solution from an international and diplomatic standpoint. We, the Port of Montreal, notably want to position ourselves as an Eastern continent gateway for the new Indo-Pacific policy by the Canadian government. We're having actually some meetings today in Toronto regarding that concept. So having direct connection, let's say, with between Montreal and India would make plenty of sense in that new dynamic. So we're not only a logistic hub, we're also a diplomatic tool for the Canadian government.
And I think one of the things we've looked at as well is the Canadian European Trade Agreement, CETA. As we look at the math on it, Europeans have done a much better job of accessing Canada than we've done of accessing Europe. Thoughts on how we can better use your organization to crack that?
Well, one of the very key features of Europort in Montreal is that it exports 50% of its volumes and it imports 50% of the volumes. So goods being exported from Ontario comes to the Port of Montreal and then go to Europe and then to other countries. So it's a tool to actually, Canada is the only G7 country that has free trade agreements with all 7 countries. We at the Port of Montreal really benefit from that because not only we're in connection with 140 countries, but in Europe, we are the preferred gateway with European countries, not only to import goods, but also to export and create good conditions for Quebec and Ontario. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I know your very good colleague in Montreal is Michel Leblanc, my counterpart at the Montreal Chamber. And Michel runs a program that we also run. In fact, we started it here in Toronto called the Trade Accelerator, which is helping medium-sized businesses that are export ready develop export strategies. And I know he does tours of the port to help these businesses understand the logistics requirement behind. So I think there's a lot that's happening that you're able to do to help us drive trade. So that's just terrific. We've got time for one more question. I mean, you know, there's a lot of information that you've shared that people just aren't thinking about, not aware of. You talked again about how discrete the role of the port is, the importance of goods movement. When you look to the future, what are the top 3 things that you think need to happen? What are the actions we can ask for folks in this room and that your organization will be taking on to really make a difference as we try to move forward on your ambition for this gateway?
I think the first one, and I'm looking at my colleagues, notably Melanie, port today are tolerated. I want port and logistic players to be admired soon as being part of the solution. That's one thing. Second thing, there was a discussion about diversity today in other panels. We absolutely need women talent in the logistic business. It's a tax-savvy industry that needs to be better known to attract talent. And one of the things also that we're dedicating a lot of effort on is reaching out to Indigenous communities. We really need to engage into meaningful, long-term discussion, relationship, and not be too transactional and go see the Indigenous community only when you have a project. We want them to support our initiatives. We need their talent, we need their brain, really consider them as stakeholders, as important as anyone else in that supply chain. But I'm very enthusiastic about the future. Today, September, is great news. We're back to normal. Europort is doing fine. So we're back in business. It's been challenging 3 years, but we're back to normal now.
Okay, and how much volume do you anticipate you'll be handling in the next 5 years from now?
5 years from now? 60% more containers, because our next expansion will be full, because I think we will find a way to use much more properly the St. Lawrence Seaway and remove trucks and reduce our common GHG. So I really think when we're back in 5 years in this room and you say, you know what, we're not talking about Montreal or Toronto anymore. We have the St. Lawrence Great Lakes corridor in mind. That would be a super achievement, and our expansion will be full.
That would be, well, it's terrific, and it's exciting news for all of us. Martin, I want to thank you so much. Martin is happy to give 3 minutes back for cocktails. If we were in Montreal, we would have had cocktails in the room.
We would have cocktail before. Thank you so much, because we're the waiting moment between you and the cocktail. Thank you so much.
But your energy is inspirational, so thank you so much. And I hope we're taking away good insights into what is possible and within our grasp. So thank you so much, Bertin.
Thanks to you.
Bonne chance.